Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Kiva from ECC and I'd like to introduce you to Nathan Ghann, who will be facilitating this session on doing racial inclusion differently from job boards to the boardroom. Nathan is Programme Director at the Educate Group, a social enterprise focused on increasing inclusion and improving outcomes for the least representative groups in higher education. Nathan has over 10 years experience working in the sector, and Nathan's full biography will be on the conference website. This session will identify the specific barriers and challenges being faced by the least representative ethnic groups in the sector and how universities are responding to redress issues that have become commonplace. The aim of this session is that you will leave with practical and new ways to address recruitment, reward, and progression of diverse talent for both academic and professional staff members. You can use the Q&A function throughout the session, and Nathan will come back to you after his presentation. There's also chat available if you'd like to add any comments at any point. Now I'm delighted to pass you over to Nathan. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you so much, Kiva, and thank you all. Good afternoon and welcome. Really great to have you here today to discuss racial inclusion and doing it differently. So the session's aims and objectives are, as kind of Kiva mentioned, to understand the main barriers and challenges experienced by racially minoritized groups, identify how universities are responding to these challenges, and exploring new and different approaches to increasing racial inclusion both in and out of the sector. I like to start off every conversation in this space with just some principles around respectful inquiry. So at the end, there will be questions and hopefully a little bit of time for dialogue. But these are some of the main principles I'd like you to be aware of just as we start to have this conversation. So the first one is listening. We really want to listen to actively understand before responding. So often, especially in time-pressured environments, we might listen just to respond. But where we can, take a moment just to listen to, try to understand the other's viewpoint before responding. Emotional awareness, so being aware of the emotional responses in others and as well as in ourselves at different information. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of information and just be aware of how different pieces of this information might make you feel and those emotional responses in others. Respect, so allowance of differing views and respectful disagreement. So we can disagree and I can still respect you as an individual. And it's important that we foster conversations with that in mind. And lastly, nurture. So just valuing care and empathy in our communication, as well as self-care with ourselves. So if anything shared today, I know there's going to be a range of people in this session, those with family and friends who could be impacted with some of these issues. You may find this triggering or a little bit overwhelming. You might want to just take a moment to yourself, but be aware of just having self-care and that empathy towards this topic. So what are the big challenges in the sector? So got a long list here, and we've got numerous reports over the years that have kind of started to speak about racial differences and disparities across the sector. But some of these, and the kind of most prevalent, we see are kind of lack of diversity and senior level representation, ethnicity pay gap, and specifically we see that kind of middle majority, the median, is more or less the same. However, we see that more Black, Asian, mixed heritage staff members will be on fixed term, potentially temporary contracts than their white counterparts. We see a rise in inequality outcomes, and many of you would have heard of the degree awarding gap and other gaps around non-continuation, and all of these feed into staff representation in the wider sense. Academic flight, so that's a concept that was researched quite a few years ago, and that's where academics of colour felt that they found more value in international contexts and therefore moved their research and what they were pursuing to other countries, and leaving that kind of gap in between. Attracting diverse talent, disparity in staff satisfaction surveys, increase in staff complaints, and unrecognized workload. So there's a lot going on around the challenges of really creating racially inclusive environments. And just to say at this point, I'm recovering from a cold, so I have got my water handy. But if you see me coughing, please be patient with me as I progress. So the biggest is the lack of senior level representation. This is seen to be one of the factors that, if was solved, could help solve many of the other issues that we find in the sector. But what's exactly happening with this? So between 2012-13 academic year and 2015-16 academic year, and a little bit more recently, between 18-19 and 19-20, HESA reported that there was 0 Black managers, directors, and senior officials in higher education. Now, I guess the qualified category of manager, director, and senior official is linked to kind of the expert HR databases as well as UCA databases, and this speaks to deans and above, so deans all the way up to vice chancellor level. So we see out of roughly around 500 senior leaders that there is no Black representation. I just want to caveat that 0 could indicate up to probably 4, maybe 5, and it's not shown for statistical rounding, but still vastly underrepresented at those levels. And we have to take a moment to look back and think about the pipeline and what's actually happening, what's leading to this. So what we can see here is just a trajectory plotted out by Advanced HE. We see that in 2018-19 year, Black, Asian, mixed heritage students came in at around 25% of the rate. I believe this is a bit more increased currently, close to 30%. And then our white students are at 75% rounded. And when we look at the trajectory going forward, then we see that when we enter into research postgraduates, we start to see that dip, academic staff dip, and then professorship dip. However, if you know, on the face of this, it would look like there's a similar amount of professors that are of academic staff from the BAME category. And this is the first indication of the problem around the terminology BAME. And I could talk for a long time about it, but often BAME really brings together and conceals lots of individual ethnic categories, and maybe doesn't allow us to really examine different experiences within the data. So if we was to look deeper into the data, what we would see is our professional body, and we see that our white professors are around 90%, Asian at 3.6%, Chinese at 2.2%, other at 1.3%, mixed at 1.2%, and Black at 0.6%. And this is really key, because to have senior leadership at the dean level and above, we know that there has to be that academic trajectory. There's that professorship that is needed, that body of work, the research, and so forth. And at current numbers, if we was to put it into actual numbers, around 140 professors are Black. And, you know, this is where we have to start thinking about intersectionality and gender. Where we think about gender and think about Black female professors, we see that actually only out of the 140, only 35 of them are Black female professors. And that's a shocking number, taking into consideration that we have a professorship of around 15,000 across the UK. And it speaks to there's something happening along the process, along the journey, where we don't have higher numbers of representation at that level. So I just took this snippet out of a Times Higher Education article written by Dr. Winston Morgan, who spoke quite candidly about his own experience to professorship. So he's a Black professor in toxicology. And he says, I recently spoke to a white professor colleague about the key figures involved in shaping his career. He was able to quickly reel off a list of individuals who'd facilitated, mentored, or sponsored his career. As a reader, the key individuals in my career have, by contrast, been those who have either blocked or delayed my progress. the positive figures tended to be those who enabled me to recover from negative experiences. Much more of my time was spent defending myself against those who found it difficult to accept that I could be a good scientist. And we see echoes of this sentiment coming through in surveys, but also in the literature. So Professor Nicola Rollock put forward in 2019, she actually interviewed a large proportion of the Black female professors about their journeys. And I believe at the time there was only 25, but they spoke of the path to professorship being somewhat protracted and opaque, and having to experience quite significant barriers, not feeling supported or not feeling like they were seen to be credible to reach to that status. We also see stories of that in a book called The Ivory Tower, and that's on Amazon if you want to have a look at it. But this sentiment is coming out from our professors of colour. The UCU did a survey in 2016, and these were just some of the highlights of what they found. So 90% of respondents from higher education said they had often or sometimes faced barriers when seeking promotion. And this was focusing on Black, Asian, mixed heritage staff members. More than half of the respondents from higher education disagreed strongly or somewhat with the statement, "I've been supported in seeking progression and promotion in my career by my senior colleagues." 7 out of 10 respondents in higher education reported they were often or sometimes subject to bullying and harassment from managers, which is a really shocking stat to see. And so we start to see that there is a very different experience being had by academic staff members of colour. The report Tackling Racial Harassment, Universities Challenge, came out a few years ago, and this was the first time I felt it was quite seminal, because it was the first time that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission had really shone a mirror onto universities. And their posit was that they felt that universities were very unaware of the level of racial harassment and racism taking place on their campuses, between students, but also for staff. Some of the key findings from that report was that 33% of staff had experienced racist name calling, insults and jokes, and often were drawing on racial or religious tropes. So this thought process of witnessing or experiencing these jokes, or what's being seen now in the media as banter, and I'm, banter is not banter if two people aren't laughing. And so really thinking about how we are talking about racial harassment in and of itself. 70% had experienced racial harassment and reported microaggressive acts and demeaning behaviors. And so this real spotlight was placed on microaggressions, this more covert racism taking place. So we've got the overt acts of hate crime, but underneath there is these covert micro inequities, and specifically around these microaggressions. And microaggressions, and I don't want to go too much into it for time, but it is the devaluement of another person's identity, culture, or ethnicity in any way, shape, or form. Okay, and we might see this in certain instances of anglicizing people's names, of saying that, your name's too hard to pronounce, I'll call you X for short. It could be saying that I want to touch your hair. It could be dismissing or not giving people voices. There's a range of ways microaggressions can show themselves, but because it's quite subtle, it can be very hard to identify, but also hard for victims to be able to report on. What was interesting from this report was that 80% of staff said that this was a pattern of repetitive and escalating behavior. These weren't one-off incidents. These are things that were happening continuously through their experience. And less than 50% had reported it to staff. And what was interesting is the reasons as to why. So for some, they talked about fear of losing their job or being seen as a troublemaker, or somewhat being blacklisted as a troublemaker within the institution. But there was another side to it which universities really responded to from this, and that was just not knowing how, not knowing who to talk to. There not being the correct reporting lines or systems in place to effectively communicate racial harassment. And so there's been a response with a lot more universities adapting their report and support websites and functions. But I still find that there isn't a really effective report and support structure that really thinks through the whole process, not just from reporting, but processing all the way to the end, and ensuring that it is fit for purpose. So these are some of the issues that has been brought forward in this report. So what's been the sector's response? Well, the Race Equality Charter, we've now got 80 members, 80 different university institutions that have signed up. And there are, I think, about 15 that have been awarded a bronze level award. Currently, there is no institutions that have the silver level of award. But the bronze level award speaks to institutions who have actually got action plans in place. They've looked through their data thoroughly and found where the biggest racialized disparities are and have made actions to address them. And so some of these actions collated, when I looked through all the different actions, these were the top 3 that I could see reoccurring in what universities are working to do. So firstly is raising awareness of racial inequality to all staff. And that's not just talking about some of the issues, but also giving people the language and the terminology to have meaningful conversations about race. Again, a lot of racial literacy wasn't given to people in their schooling or in their education process. And there's a need to give people that language and terminology to have productive conversations. An increase in BAME staff recruitment. So that's a kind of big driver, but also a recognition that sometimes with institutions that have a lot of BAME staff, or there is a lot of diversity, we see that those individuals are in the lower tiers of the grading scales or the lower functions of the organization. And therefore, there's a very notable focus on increasing BAME staff at senior levels. And so this is what the sector is now working towards. The elephant in the room. So the elephant in the room is when we start to think about the question of how do we attract diverse talent? How do we bring in more diverse talent and diversifies our talent pool? We have to recognize the barriers that actually exist. So in 2017, BBC Inside Out program did a social experiment. They put out a CV, identical CVs, and all that was changed was the name, Mohammed Alam to Adam Henton. And what they found was what we've seen or confirmed in previous and existing research was that Adam Henton was had to send in much fewer applications to receive a callback for interview, whereas Mohammed Alam had to send twice as many applications for that same interview. And I've put the link in there so you can have a look at the video and the program and so forth. But this speaks to some research that was done by the SEALs in 2016. This was in America. And what they found, and they did a real deep dive into what was occurring here, but they found that around 33% of their participants in their study had whitened their CV. Okay. And so what this means, the term whitened, links to critical whiteness studies and so forth. But whitening includes changing their name to be more anglicized, changing their interests. So there was instances of maybe speaking more about outdoor activities or kind of the countryside rather than urban settings or inner city settings, and their experiences. So if they had been part of, I think the example was the Black Society for Engineers, they removed the Black terminology and just put Society of Engineers to appear more invisible, as it were. What's really interesting is, regardless of whether CVs were whitened or not, it didn't mean that there was less bias at interview. So it did mean that participants were more likely to be asked to come to interview, but it didn't mean when they arrived there was any less bias. Bringing it back to the UK, Heath and D'Estasio did some research out of Oxford University, really deep research actually, where they looked at over 3,200 employers across a range of jobs. And they were trying to see if competency had a factor, like if somebody's competency could mean that they would more likely to get a job or not. I've put this graph in here and I've put a lot of information in these slides, not for you to, these slides will be sent thereafter to you. but it's for you to be able to follow up, follow the links, and then be able to have fruitful conversations about this afterwards. But they found that ethnic minorities in Britain need to send 60% more applications to be able to get an interview. And regardless of competency demonstrated, employers were less likely to hire those from ethnic minority backgrounds. And they speak about this in terms of two sides. One is they feel that there could be a signaling factor, that if somebody's from an ethnic background, they may be less skilled or able to do the job. But also there's called a taste-based theory of, even if they wanted to maximize profit and they wanted to make the most, and they could see that these candidates could do so, they would rather incur the cost of not reaching that profit than to hire these individuals. So this is some really fascinating research, and really exposing in the state of how recruitment's taking place in this day and age. And another insight, lastly, was candidates from more Islamic-centric nations receive the lowest callback. So the MENA states, the Middle East, and so forth. So we see that even if we start to think about how we diversify our job boards and try to get more diverse talent in, there is that thought process about what happens when they do come through the door. So that puts me to the case for change. And this is where I feel like we need to do racial inclusion differently. For the longest time, I think we've been asking the question, how do we get more diverse talent through the door? And I think that needs to change to, who do we need to be to attract and keep diverse talent? And I say that just from my experience. I've worked in, as was mentioned, higher education 10 years. I've lectured students that I've gone to see go into FTSE 100 companies, become senior managers. I see diverse talent all around me, people that have gone before me, and so forth. Diverse talent exists in many forms and facets. The question is, are our institutions places where diverse talent wants to go to and be part of? The three questions that I think then needs to be asked is, how knowledgeable are our teams and managers about racial equity? What initiatives are we supporting or leading on that we can show as part of our job descriptions and our advertisements, that actual actions that we're taking? And how is inclusion embedded in all that we do? This lens of inclusion, rather than it being a side bullet point of an agenda. How do we start to think of EDI as just this lens, this framework that we approach in everything that we do? So it's really important to think about, are applications anonymized? And how can we anonymize applications at point of entry? That will increase the level of trust from diverse talent. Will every interview panel have diverse members? And again, this seems quite hard to do, but actually you can create a pool of diverse representatives, 15 to 20. I know when I was chairing the staff network at my university, I was putting together a pool of people that could be called upon to join interview panels. Again, they could be from the faculty or the department, but they're remunerated for their days, worth of work to support being a critical eye or critical friend on those panels. Are interviews structured and standardized using a points-based scoring system? So what we see again and again in the research is structure, whilst it doesn't eliminate bias by any means, it does mitigate it and it does reduce it. For example, we might talk about cultural fit. Even as myself, as a manager, I'm looking for candidates that meet the fit of the culture of my team. But we need to actually write down, what is that culture? Because when it's left vague and ambiguous, then that's where racial bias can exist. Is it that we have teams that we want everyone to stop at 5 and no one answers emails? Or do we want a team that works weekends? And what is the culture of that team? And how can we write it down? And how can we create questions that align to that cultural fit? So I just want to give you a few examples. I know time's going. I'm trying to get a lot in a short amount of time, but just a few examples of how companies and institutions are doing racial inclusion differently, with a look at themselves, this examining of themselves. So Openreach wanted to attract more women engineers into their portfolio of employees. And so what they did is they started to embark on doing more inclusive job descriptions. So the research shows that many job descriptions, for various reasons, can make people feel excluded from applying. And what they found, they actually did research and a study, and I've put a link in there so you can have a look thereafter. But they found a huge increase in women being interested in their engineering roles when the language of the job description was changed. And so this was really fascinating. I think I remember the stats being before 36% weren't interested, and then that dropped to 13% after that change of language. So they're seeing great changes, and their HR director really spoke like profusely about the need to be doing this across all their job descriptions and what they do. So as a result, there's been a range of new AI startups who are delivering something called augmented writing, where you put in the job description, it scans it, and it pops up the words that could be either highly gendered language, might be exclusionary or outdated terms, might point to age bias, and even job titles that could be putting someone off. So age bias, if you use words such as like, we're looking for youthful, new, vibrant team members, that can make someone feel like they may not want to apply for that role. And for example, one of these companies, Textio, talk about there being at least a 10% increase in diverse applications just by changing that job description. So again, I've put the links in. We see then when our candidates are in and they're inside, we need to really be thinking, if we're again thinking about that senior level leadership, is what are we doing with the talent that we have in-house, right? So De Montfort are really leading in this space. From what I've seen, they've created something called an Early Career Academic Fellows Program. And this is a kind of 2-year tracked tenor program where they take people from their postgraduate qualification, and as long as those individuals meet all the objectives across the 2 years, they have a guaranteed academic position with the institution that has both research and teaching allocated to it, and then has that path to professorship along the way. And the interesting finding that they found is by doing this, they found that there was almost a 50-50 split between BAME academics. So as you can see here, 44%, 47% of ECAF roles were held by BAME academics, and women counting for, again, 50% of those roles. So again, thinking about what are the onboarding or on-ramping programs that we can create that gives protection to certain research interests, and says, if you can follow this program and meet these objectives, you have a role in a vacancy here. A really, really powerful way to do it. Cambridge saw an increase in BAME professional support staff progressing after engaging in secondment activity. So again, even thinking about how are we encouraging secondments and rotations, because it obviously has an impact in how people choose to progress in their careers. What's interesting about this is the data shows that there is much more diversity in the professional services side of the staff workforce than there is in the academics. And so how can we think about allowing for professional services members to be introduced to academic careers, right? They might have an undergraduate degree, they might have their master's. How do we start to get them thinking about, is this something that you'd like to do? And it might not be for everyone, but if there's 5 or 10, that will make a huge difference to some of the numbers that we're seeing. And then lastly, senior leaders and boardrooms. So inclusive boards, they work to get more diversity onto senior boards. And there's a really interesting case study with the co-op, so the cooperative, and they utilize independent non-executive directors, so INEDs. And these are non-executive directors who maybe aren't part of the institution or as part of the company, but have been brought in for their specialist expertise, and that could be in finance, legal, and technical, to be that that non-executive director that can speak on those issues. And they've used it as an opportunity to bring in more diversity. So if you did a Google search look at Co-op's board, you'll see that there's a mix of independent non-executive directors as well as non-executive directors. So a really straightforward way to start to diversify that board. Board shadowing, so board apprentice, they actually do some board shadowing and train people to be board members, and they boast 75% going on to boards after a year. And this is kind of really interesting, because the thought process of yes, board members do need to be trained given that experience, but even within our institutions, how are we encouraging our Black, Asian, mixed heritage staff members to join committees and join boards in different ways to get that experience? And then lastly, Advanced HE at the beginning of this month pushed out their board diversity inclusion toolkit. Really interesting. I've put the link in here. And this speaks to more about getting the board ready for diversity and how the board can start to think about diverse voices. Kind of links to more research around boards not feeling that people are qualified, diverse people are as qualified, and that's the reason for lack of board diversity. So I just want to end with this. I think there's 3 questions that we should be able to answer if we are truly wanting to engage diverse talent. These are 3 questions that I think every diverse, racially diverse, but also from the other protected characteristics have in their mind about whether they want to join an organization or not, knowing they're talented, knowing they have something to offer. The first is, to what extent will I be able to thrive? Thrive being defined as the opportunity to flourish, to grow, and to develop. Okay. And so we need to be able to answer 2 questions. What contextual developmental opportunities do we have in place? And when I say contextual developmental opportunities, what I mean is, if we have a leadership program that's open to everyone, do we also have a Black, Asian, mixed heritage leadership program? Is that on offer? And some might say, well, we don't want to separate the 2. But actually, I think we need both. There are going to be some staff members that are happy just to go on an open program, but others who would want their lived experience to be taken into account, and also to be guided and those sessions to be facilitated by other people who have had the same lived experience. And we see this in women in leadership development programs. And so why are we not doing it when it comes to race and ethnicity? How can we systemize progression conversations? So taking away the onus for line managers to ask the right questions and tease out progression conversations, but actually systematize it. I think there's 3 questions. 1, where would you like to be in 5 years? And that's just where, the trajectory. And if the person's unsure, which they might be because they are, new to this environment or for whatever, then give them the opportunity to go and explore, to try new things, maybe a day and a half, allocated to just shadow certain other roles and functions within the organization that they might like. Really powerful. But we need to get an understanding of where they would like to go to in their trajectory. 2, what do you need from me? So this question's quite big, popularized by David McQueen, who's an inclusive leadership expert. And he talks about leaders needing to start asking not what would you like, but what do you need from us? Allowing the individual to really think deeply about what is it that would help them towards their goal, and allowing for that agency. And finally, here is a list of development opportunities. What would you like to take? So instead of waiting for people to say, hey, I'd like to go on this course or that course, presenting a list. And some of that, again, could be contextual. Some of it can be open programs. But as managers should know, what are the developmental needs and what courses, training, and even if there's no budget, what books can they be reflecting on? What videos can they watch? What networking events can they go to? But these are the 3 questions that I think need to be systematized. The next big question is, will I belong? And belongingness is a huge concept. I just want to say very briefly, it's not about will I be liked. It is more about, will my contribution be valued, and will I see the impact of my work? So I've put a link in there around belongingness, around a project that Google did called Project Aristotle. And it is fascinating what they found. And they found the most effective teams were the ones that felt like they most belonged in their team. So have a look at that research. But we need to think about, where can we start to develop belongingness within teams, and where can we frequently affirm contributions of our team members, and how can we support line managers to do so? And lastly, do the people I work with understand or advocate for race equity? So have we trained our line managers in racial fluency? The research has shown that, the author of Racial Fluency showed that managers were much more comfortable talking about gender than they were about race. And it's important that our line managers have this language. So if there is a staff member going through a microaggression or having experienced racial harassment, the line manager has the language to at least have that conversation about it with their staff member. And lastly, are we rewarding and awarding inclusive behaviors? A case study in there shows a company that's kind of hijacked Employee of the Month and they've done a Make Others Great campaign. So they give awards to team members who've helped other team members immensely, and they kind of do a little press release on them and everything. And I think that's where we need to move to. How can we start to reward and award for inclusive behaviors throughout our institution if it's a core value to us? And the big question, my last one, the big question is, where might racial bias be able to exist in our current systems and processes? So moving from we are not racist to a we are anti-racist takes a moment of reflection. It takes a moment to say, actually, where could racial bias actually be able to exist in what we do? And then how are we trying to mitigate or reduce that to the best of our ability? I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'm open to all questions. If you want to connect with me after, I've put my LinkedIn, or we can schedule a call if you want to talk about some more contextual things within your sphere of influence. Great stuff.
Nathan, we've got a couple of questions in the question and answer box. So the first one is from Angela. I believe Angela's from Ulster University.
Yeah.
Angela, do you want me to read out the question for you, or do you want to do it yourself? Okay, so Angela loves the idea of creating a pool of network staff to sit on recruitment panels. How can we manage this pool most effectively?
Fantastic question. Great question. So I would say, and when I was in the process of trying to design it, it was to actually reach the staff network chairs and the vice chairs and say, can you put out a call to all staff and ask if they want to engage in this? Offer training first. That's the most important thing. So to kind of maybe do a half-day training on just how to be effective interview panel member, and just say, are there time periods that we can call upon you? So there's going to be time periods, marking, assessments. Everyone's got different timetables, but try and find time periods that someone says, you know what, for the month of March, I can do one half day, or I can do one day on that month. And the big thing is not to make it onerous on just a few people. So the more you can spread it out and just say, we will remunerate that day, but can you offer maybe 4 days out of the year? Then it becomes extremely manageable. Thank you.
Okay, I have one more question, and this is from Dawn Foster from Goldsmiths. I'll read it out for you, Dawn. If we are grouping numbers under BAM, are we really addressing the elephant in the room?
So, good question. And I'm just nearly finishing an article around to BAME or not to BAME. That's the question, or is that the question? Right. So BAME has been born out of administrative need, and it links to the kind of ethnicity descriptors. I think you're right. I think we have to start to think about the context of how we have these conversations. So one side, in administrative purposes, it's been useful. The other side is how we start to move from talking about communities of color, and how do we start to speak with communities of color? There's other terms that I think are more useful. So racially minoritized, or the racial global majority are more useful. And I think, but that comes with the language and terminology. I think you have to bring everyone along on that journey. It can't be one or two people changing terms. I think everyone has to engage and say, we're going to really take some time to think about the way we speak and the way we write about communities of color. I hope that answers your question, Dawn.
Okay, Nathan, just on behalf of ECC, I'd just like to thank you. That was a brilliant session, really, really interesting. And from some of the stuff in the chat and question and answers, I believe the delegates feel the same as I do. For delegates, just to let you know, lunch and networking is next on the agenda. It would be really good if you could try and take part in the networking carousel. You might bump into old colleagues or make some new connections. I can see very familiar names here in the audience, which is really good to see. Just following the break, we're going to have our AGM, and then we've got our first ever ECC award announcement, which will start at 1 o'clock. Just can I go back to the AGM? As a membership organisation, you are our members of the consortium, and we would encourage you to attend this because ECC belongs to you guys. And that's it. Thank you so much. Again, Nathan, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Awesome.
Oh, and the slides will be available on our website.
Yeah.